After discussing the qualifications for elders in the church, Paul then goes on to talk to Timothy about the qualifications for deacons. Now, before we get into the text, we need to understand what a deacon is. The word simply means a servant, and this would be a servant of the church. They would be working under the oversight of the elders that Paul had just talked to Timothy about. Now, in one sense, all Christians can and should be servants, but this is for an official position or an official role in the church. So this is what we're talking about here. So let's look at the text. 1 Timothy chapter 3, beginning in verse 8, he says, "Deacons likewise must be men of dignity, not double-tongued or addicted to much wine or fond of sordid gain, but holding to the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience. These men must also first be tested, then let them serve as deacons if they are beyond reproach." So here Paul begins to outline the qualifications for deacons. And as we look at these qualifications, here at the beginning, he's talking about their character and who they are to be. He begins by saying that they are to be men of dignity. Now this word dignity is translated in Philippians 4 and verse 8 as honorable. That they are to have a reputation of being honorable or trustworthy, that people can rely on them, they can depend on them. Now, the King James Version uses the word grave here. And when we think about grave as the connotation of that is that he must be serious. Well, this is what Paul is talking about here. Because of the importance of the work that he has in representing the church, he is to be dignified. He is to be serious. He is to take this work seriously. And so he is to be a man of dignity. Then Paul said he is not to be double-tongued. This idea of being double-tongued means that he's saying different things to different people in a way that would be an attempt to deceive them. So this goes along with what we just mentioned with him being a person of dignity or a man of dignity, that he is honorable, he is trustworthy. He's not saying one thing to one person and then saying something else to another person. But he is honest and he is consistent and people recognize that they can rely on him. Now the next qualification here is one that there are some questions about as far as what exactly Paul is talking about here. And we saw a similar qualification for those of the elders earlier here in this chapter. Now where Paul says that he is not addicted to much wine. Now the wording of the qualification for elders in verse 3 of this chapter, it says not addicted to wine. So the idea that some people have put forth here is that the elder is not to be addicted to or given to. We talked about what that means. Not to be given to wine, but then with the deacon it says not addicted to or given to much wine. So the argument goes is that the elder is to abstain from this, but the deacon, he can partake of wine as long as he keeps himself under control and doesn't proceed to drunkenness. That's not what this term or not what this phrase is talking about. When it says he is not addicted to much wine, that word is used elsewhere by Paul in this letter. It's used in 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 4, where he tells them not to pay attention to myths and endless genealogies. It's used in 1 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 1, where it says the Spirit explicitly says that in the later times some will fall away from the faith, paying attention to deceitful spirits and doctrines of demons. It's used in chapter 4 and verse 13, where Paul says, "Until I come, give attention to the public reading of the Scripture, to exhortation and to teaching." The word that is translated give attention or pay attention in those verses is what is used here in 1 Timothy 3 and verse 8, where it's not that he is not to have a drinking problem or that he is not to be an alcoholic. That's not what this is talking about. Instead, it means that he's not paying attention to it. Those who defend social drinking and those who want to portray this as something that is perfectly allowable just so long as someone does not proceed to drunkenness, well, they're already giving too much attention to alcohol. This is something that Not only is he not to proceed to drunkenness, but he is not to give his attention to this. This is what Paul is talking about here. So this is more than just, well, he's not to get drunk. He is to avoid alcohol. That's what this means, is Paul is giving this qualification here. And then the deacons also, it says they're not to be fond of sordid gain. The same idea as the elder in verse 3 of this chapter, where they are to be free from the love of money. That he is not to have this problem where this is what he is focused on and this is what he pursues. Because the deacon, because he is in a servant role, a servant position in the church, doing the work of the church, he is often going to be entrusted with the church's resources to do its work. He could have access to the treasury of the church. He needs to be someone who is trusted. Again, going back to the idea of being a man of dignity, that he is honorable. People know that he can be relied upon. He is to not be fond of sordid gain. They are to know that they can trust him with the money and other resources that the church may have. Then Paul says he is to be holding the mystery of faith with a clear conscience. Now, we'll talk about this mystery more in just a little bit as we get further on in this chapter, where Paul is going to talk about the mystery of godliness. But just to summarize it just briefly, what he means here, where he's holding to the mystery of the faith, he's talking about the message of the gospel, that he is to hold fast to it. He is to be a man of faith, a man of conviction, that he's not just someone who is able to do some things that are useful. He is one who is sound in the faith and is firmly committed to following the Lord, holding fast to the faith with a clear conscience, which means he is sincerely obeying the Lord. So Paul says, let them first be tested, and then let them serve as deacons if they are beyond reproach. Again, we're talking about, as I mentioned at the beginning here, someone who is in an official role of serving the church. So Paul's point here is that he needs to be put to the test, to serve before receiving an official role or an official designation as a deacon. And again, all of us can serve in different capacities. Well, we have to be doing this. And from among those who are serving in different capacities, then the elders are able to see who is doing the work, who is able to be relied upon, who is fulfilling or has fulfilled these other qualifications, and then let them serve as deacons if they are beyond reproach. So they're able and willing to do the work, and their character is what it ought to be. Then as Paul continues, he talks about certain qualifications of wives of elders and deacons, and also additional qualifications for deacons. In 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 11 through 13, he says, women must likewise be dignified, not malicious gossips, but temperate, faithful in all things. Deacons must be husbands of only one wife, and good managers of their children and their households. For those who have served well as deacons obtain for themselves a high standing and great confidence in the faith that is in Christ Jesus. So now Paul is talking about here certain qualifications for the wives and also the household of these men. First, the character of the wives, and these would be the wives of the elders and deacons. Now, again, as we notice with the deacons, all Christians are to be servants in some sense. And for the women here that are being talked about, they are all to be of a certain character. All Christians, both men and women, are to possess these qualities, but he is specifically in this context talking about the wives of the men who would serve in these roles of elders and deacons. So there are certain things that are necessary for their character. One is they are to be dignified. Same Greek word that we noticed in verse 8 for the character of the deacons, so we won't get into it in more detail now, but they are to be dignified, honorable, trustworthy. They are not to be malicious gossips. Paul stressed this idea of not being a gossip particularly when he's talking about women. Not that women are the only ones who could be gossips, but this is something that he needed to stress as he talked about the different roles that they would play. In 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 13, he talked about women who would go from house to house, being idle and also engaging in gossip and being busybodies, that there was a problem with this happening among the brethren there, and he wanted to correct this. Now, as he's talking about the role of the wives of the elders and the deacons, this is especially going to be important. They cannot be engaged in this activity, because with the position that they are in, or their husbands are in, they may have information that does not need to get out. Elders who hear something from someone, whether they're giving them counsel or they're having to correct them on some issue, they will have information that may not need to be public about people in the congregation. And if his wife is one of these gossips or malicious gossips, then that gets out. That's going to be detrimental to the work of the elder and the unity of the church. If elders cannot be trusted because their wives are gossips, then they cannot properly shepherd the flock. So this is why this qualification is given here, that they are not to be malicious gossips. Instead, he says they are to be temperate. Same word that was found in chapter 3 and verse 2 in talking about the qualifications for the elders. And we mentioned there about how this is connected to alcohol, that he is to be thinking clearly. Well, the same thing for the wives. They are to be temperate. They are to be able to think clearly about things. And this is important because they are going to be in some way involved in this work and supporting their husbands in the work that they are doing. And they are to be faithful in all things. Not just faithful to her husband, though that would be included in this, but also faithful to the Lord. And a side note here, we talked about this when we talked about the children of the elders and the different ideas that people have about whether the children must be faithful Christians or merely faithful to their father. This is the same word that's used in Titus 1 and verse 6 to refer to faithful children or children who believe. It's the same word here for the wife. It's interesting that you have many people who will argue that the children only need to be faithful to the father and not necessarily faithful Christians. But they don't make the same argument for the wives here. Could she be faithful to her husband but not a Christian? Would she meet the qualification of being faithful here? Now, this is referring to the fact that not only is she faithful to her husband, but she is also faithful to the Lord. Then Paul comes back to the topic of deacons, particularly talking about their household. They are to be the husband of one wife, same qualification as the elders had earlier here in chapter 3. They are to be the husband of one wife, and they are to be good managers of their children and their households. They are demonstrating their leadership, demonstrating their headship, that they are able to do this. Interestingly, when we look at the deacons here and compare them to the elders were to have children who believe. The deacons simply are good managers of their children and their own households. There's no mention of the children being faithful or believing in this passage or in a parallel passage, which suggests that the deacons could potentially be younger than the elders. They need to be old enough to be married and have children and have demonstrated that they can manage their household well, but they may be younger than the elders and still meet these qualifications. So Paul here in this chapter, he talks about elders, he talks about deacons, he talks about the wives of these men, and all of these are working together for the function of the local church.